What if all you had was faith, and half a loaf of bread? A story of kindness and karma. Can a crust of old bread change a life? Can a crust of old bread truly change a person's life? In the cold, forgotten corners of the world, is there still room for a small heart that dares to love? If that question made you pause for even a moment, then you've already begun to walk alongside Samuel, a boy with nothing but bare feet, a torn cloth, and a piece of bread hard as stone, yet within his heart, he carried something the world seemed to have lost: faith. Early morning. The wind whipped through cracked mud roofs, whistled through broken shutters. The dirt road to the market was crusted with dry mud, dead leaves, and silhouettes rushing past in the bitter cold. Amid this hurried world, a tiny figure walked slowly, barefoot on stones, each step carving pain into tender skin. Samuel, though he had no name, yet owned nothing but a knee-length ragged shirt and a stale piece of bread wrapped in a dirty cloth. He clutched it tightly in his palm, as if it held the last warmth he could salvage from this world. His eyes carried no hatred, no despair, only a strange glimmer, a kind of hope that refused to go out, even if no one cared to receive it. He wandered through the rows of early morning market stalls, where grown-ups bustled about setting up their goods. Laughter echoed through the scent of grilled meat, ripe fruit, and fresh bread. It was a world brimming with life, yet completely blind to the presence of a boy. "Get lost. You're filthy, you'll scare away my customers," a woman snapped, swatting him with a bag of vegetables. He stumbled. But even as he fell, Samuel held tightly to the bread. He cradled it to his chest like a child guarding his own heart. "I'm not asking for money," he tried to say softly, but his throat was dry, the words trapped. He wasn't angry. He simply sat there among the garbage, looking at the piece of bread and whispering, "You're still here, aren't you?" As if speaking to his only friend. He smiled. Not from joy but from gratitude. In Buddhist teachings, there's a saying, "Knowing sufficiency is true wealth." And indeed, in a city of excess, only this homeless child truly knew what it meant to have enough. After sitting a while, he slowly broke the bread in two, gently, reverently, and stood. Passing by a crumbling brick wall near the market, Samuel noticed a small dog, ribs sticking out like rope, curled up in the cold sunlight. He knelt down and placed half the rock-hard bread in front of its snout. "We'll share. It's not tasty, but it's ours," he whispered, asking for no witness. And in that moment, the sky seemed to pause. A gray cloud shifted, allowing a single ray of sunlight to fall on the boy's dusty cheek. Not enough to warm a winter day, but just enough to warm a moment. And a heart. The Buddha once said, "With one pure thought, countless sins are erased." Perhaps, somewhere in the heavens, a bodhisattva looked down and smiled, watching a child share his only possession with another living soul. That evening, when the sun had become a fading streak of red, Samuel returned to the place he called home, a crumbling shack with a torn thatch roof and a dirt floor caked in dust. The wind breathed through the cracks like the world itself sighing. He laid down the old cloth, lay upon it, but didn't sleep just yet. He knelt, placed his thin hands over his heart, closed his eyes, and prayed. "I don't know if I did right, but I shared the bread because my heart told me to. If that was wrong, please forgive me. If it was right, let me keep this heart a little longer." Outside, the wind howled like the cry of the homeless. Inside, a child's eyes closed with a peaceful smile. Maybe he was cold. Maybe he was hungry. But he was not poor. Because within his heart was a treasure no one could steal. That night, Samuel dreamed of a hand offering him a warm loaf of bread. He took it, tears rolling down his cheeks, not from hunger, but from the feeling that, for the first time, someone gave him not just bread, but love. The next morning, as the sun struggled to rise behind a veil of fog, Samuel woke to the cold seeping into every tiny joint. He shivered, pulling the cloth over his chest, though it helped little. He had dreamed again. Not of bread but of a clay house filled with laughter, a warm bed, and someone calling him by name, a name he'd never heard before, Samuel. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the damp dirt wall and the whistling wind. He looked at his hand still gripping the remaining half of the bread. Still hard as stone, but now ice cold. He kissed it softly. Not out of superstition, but as a quiet thank you. You're still with me. Dragging tired feet through the cold, wet dirt, Samuel returned to the market. Not to beg. Just to see people. To watch them live, laugh, rush around. He didn't envy them. He simply wondered. Maybe in a past life, I forgot to keep a promise. He stood quietly in front of a bakery, where the smell reached down the entire alley. A woman bought a fresh loaf, steam rising from the wrapping. Samuel didn't step closer. He stood at a distance, inhaled deeply and smiled. He who knows sufficiency is rich. People passed by. Some glanced. Others looked away. A middle-aged woman pulled her daughter past him, muttering, "Don't look at him. Those kids bring bad luck." Samuel said nothing. No defense. No protest. Just silence. But his eyes never dimmed. They still shone like a candle before the wind. Flickering, but never extinguished. In his heart, there was still a gentle belief. If no one sees me today, maybe, someone will tomorrow. He walked on. Trash beneath his feet, shattered glass, rotten fruit. His little feet scraped and bleeding. But instead of complaining, he bent down, and found something surprising. A broken umbrella and a clean piece of cloth. Samuel's eyes lit up. He held the cloth like treasure. Not a shirt but to him, a gift from the sky. Thank you, heaven. Today, I received a gift. He whispered solemnly, like a sacred ritual. Gratitude even for what others throw away is the path to inner wealth. That noon, the sun burned fiercely, but the cold wind still slipped through his torn shirt. Samuel arrived at an old wooden bridge over a dry riverbed. He crawled underneath where there was shade and enough planks to form a roof. He cleared a corner, laid the new cloth on the ground, and propped up the broken umbrella. It became a tiny house in a frozen city. And there, in that small space of sky, he sat down, pulled out the half-loaf, but didn't eat. He waited. Not sure for what. Just knowing in his heart. He wanted to give it to someone who might need it more. Above, people crossed the bridge. Some looked down. One spat. Another cursed, "Why don't you go to a shelter instead of living like a rat?" There was laughter. Mockery. Footsteps stomping loudly on the wood, as if to hurt him. Samuel closed his eyes. He didn't respond. He placed his hand over his chest and silently prayed. Please don't let my heart become like theirs. One pure thought, and 10,000 resentments dissolve. Samuel didn't know he was practicing Dharma. But in that moment, his compassion rose beyond ordinary realms. The sky darkened. The cold deepened. But within Samuel, something warm had begun to grow. Not from bread. Not from shelter. But from silence, from acceptance without bitterness. As night fell, He curled into himself, the bread still in hand. The wind howled outside, mocking. "You'll never have anything. You're nothing." But Samuel only closed his eyes and thought, "If today isn't mine, maybe tomorrow will belong to someone else. And if I help them, maybe that tomorrow will come sooner." And then he dreamed. A strange dream. A bridge leading to a home lit with warm light. Inside, a round table full of bread, full of laughter. And someone called his name. Samuel. For the first time in his life, he heard his name. Even if only in a dream. The morning after. The next morning, before the sun could pierce the heavy fog, Samuel had already left his makeshift shelter beneath the bridge. His bare feet touched the ground, frozen like ice, but he didn't complain. Too familiar with cold, hunger, and indifference, he simply bowed his head, carefully folded the clean cloth he used as a mat, and embraced the broken umbrella along with the remaining half of the bread. "This is all I have," he murmured, eyes turned to the sky, "but I know it will be enough, if I share it at the right time." It was a lesson no one had taught him, yet faith, whispering from the deepest place within his soul, kept reminding him, sharing is where miracles begin. Dragging his feet through worn-out alleys, Samuel walked slower than usual. The night before, coughing fits had jolted him awake again and again. His body trembled, his chest felt crushed as if under a heavy stone. But he still held himself upright. Because in his heart, there was still something he had to do before the day ended. As he neared a garbage pile behind the market, Samuel heard a faint cry, weak, timid, as though even the sound itself was afraid of being discovered and judged by the world. He paused, tilted his head to listen. It wasn't a cat or a dog. It was human, a child. Following the sound, Samuel reached a rotted wooden crate, toppled beside a pile of cardboard. And there amidst the filth was a little girl, even smaller than him, curled up in a soaked shirt, shivering from the cold. Her wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at him as if wanting to disappear from fear. Samuel didn't ask, "Where did you come from?" He didn't say, "Why are you here?" He simply sat down quietly, opened his cloth, and held out the remaining half of the bread with both hands as if offering treasure. "Are you hungry?" "I don't have anything else, but you can eat this." "We'll be okay," Samuel said, his voice raspy, but his gaze oddly gentle. The girl looked at him, then at the bread. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time, not from fear. From being seen. From being acknowledged. From receiving a kind gesture from a stranger, something the whole world had denied her. She took the bread, her hands trembling. Samuel quietly sat beside her, propping up the broken umbrella to block the wind. He said nothing more and didn't need to. Two children sat in silence, side by side in the cold and garbage, but with something the wealthy world above may never know, the peace born from compassion. In that moment, two abandoned souls, two fragile bodies the world refused to welcome, found each other. Not through logic. Not through blood. But through unconditional kindness. And perhaps, somewhere high above, the gods bore witness. And the bodhisattvas smiled. Because the Buddha doesn't always sit on a lotus in a grand temple. Sometimes, the Buddha is right here in the bright eyes of a child who gives even when they have nothing. Afternoon. As the city resumed its rush, people walked back and forth across the bridge, not looking down. But one man, tall, bearded, in a thick wool coat, happened to pass by. A heavy bag of blankets hung from his shoulder, meant to be sold. But what made him stop wasn't a cry. It was the silence. The kind that's too real to ignore. He saw them. Two children curled up asleep under the bridge, the broken umbrella tilted above them, a half-eaten piece of bread placed between them. The wind blew through the girl's hair, lifting it gently. And something gripped the man's heart, a sharp ache he thought he'd forgotten long ago. "Why does this hurt so much?" he whispered, eyes growing moist. He knelt, quietly removed his scarf still warm with the scent of fresh wool and placed it over the two sleeping children. He didn't wake them. He didn't speak. He simply left behind warmth, the one thing he knew might be their only hope that night. Samuel stirred slightly, opening his eyes. When he saw the stranger, he held the girl closer, startled. But the man's gaze held no threat, only sorrow and tenderness. "You remind me of someone who used to be my son," the man murmured, then turned and disappeared into the patchy light of dusk. Samuel didn't fully understand. But he knew one thing. For the first time, someone had looked at him not as trash but as a life worth embracing. The scarf smelled like sunlight. He gently pulled it around the little girl, then whispered softly, "I think God just smiled at us. Didn't he?" That night, the wind howled like it wanted to sweep away every fragile thing from this earth. But under the old bridge, where two small beings slept curled in a thick wool scarf, there was one thing the wind couldn't take, a warmth born not from fire but from the human heart. Samuel couldn't sleep. His eyes remained open, gazing at the dark wooden planks above where indifferent feet walked daily. He turned to the girl. She was still sleeping peacefully, holding the crust of bread close to her chest like a dream she didn't want to let go. A strange feeling welled up in his chest, not hunger, not cold, but responsibility. He didn't know why he felt it. Only that from the moment he handed her that piece of bread, he had ceased being just a homeless boy. He had become a brother. Tomorrow, he thought. No matter what happens, I won't leave her alone. And perhaps, in realms higher than the clouds, that heartfelt whisper reached the ears of something divine. Because in that very moment, the sky began to clear. And the first light of dawn touched Samuel's face. The next day. The next morning, Samuel gently cradled the still sleeping girl, held her close to his chest, and carefully stepped out from beneath the bridge. Every step was a decision. He had no food, no home, no papers. But he had faith and now, someone to protect. They wandered through streets and alleys. Sometimes Samuel would stop and pick up apple peels or crumbs near market stalls. He'd clean them off and place them in the girl's hand. He didn't eat. "She's younger, she needs it more than I do," he told himself. On the upper floor of a beautiful house, a woman stood behind a glass window. She had lived there for decades, seen hundreds of street children pass below, but never stopped to really look. Today was different. Her eyes followed the thin boy as he gave the last of his food to the little girl, then smiled as the child smiled. She didn't know why her heart ached. It took a moment before she picked up the phone. But this time not to complain. Not to judge. "Please come quickly. There are two children who need help. But, please don't scare them." When the police car arrived, Samuel heard the siren and instantly clutched the girl's hand. "If they separate us, remember, I'm the wind. And the wind will always be around you," he whispered. The girl nodded. Her eyes filled with tears. But she didn't cry. Strangely, the police officers who stepped out of the car that day didn't shout, didn't carry batons, and didn't have judgment in their eyes. They were just three men and one woman in uniform, and one of them knelt down in front of Samuel. You're the boy who shared your bread with a dog the other day, and then protected this little girl, right?" Samuel nodded, hesitant. The officer opened his backpack and took out 2 loaves of still steaming bread, wrapped in clean paper. "It's not much, but it's from the heart." Samuel took the bread with both hands, trembling. Not because of hunger, but because it was the first time someone had given him something without expecting anything in return. In silence, the little girl took a tiny bite, then smiled radiant, her eyes shimmering like a stream. Samuel looked up at the sky and whispered in his heart, "Could this be the first miracle?" The officers didn't say much. They simply invited the 2 of them into the vehicle and drove them to a place called the temporary shelter. It wasn't a mansion, nor was it luxurious. But for Samuel and the girl, it was the first castle of their lives. On the weathered front door of that shelter, faded words were still visible. "No one here sleeps hungry. Here, we live to love." Samuel read the words and gently squeezed the little girl's hand. "We made it, didn't we?" he whispered. The metal door creaked open. A strange scent rushed in. Not the smell of burnt bread or garbage Samuel had known for so long, but the scent of cleanliness. Diluted soap, old wood, sun-dried blankets. Samuel and the girl stepped in cautiously, as if afraid that even their footsteps might dirty the air. Inside Samuel was a mess of emotions: hope, fear, and a kind of invisible tenderness that made him hold the little girl even tighter. She still didn't speak. She just nestled against him like a warm shadow he'd vowed never to lose again. An elderly nurse stepped out from the hallway, holding a notebook and a thermometer. Seeing the children, she squinted, then slowly knelt down. "Welcome, little ones. From now on, this is your home. No one will hit you. No one will chase you away. Just eat, rest, and let your heart begin to heal." Samuel hesitated. I don't have a name. I'm just the beggar boy." The woman looked at him for a long moment. "Then from now on, you are Samuel," she said slowly. "A name for someone who listens to the voice of the heavens." Samuel didn't fully understand. But when that name rang out, his heart suddenly felt enough. As if someone had just laid the first brick in rebuilding a wall called self-worth. That first night in the shelter, Samuel couldn't sleep. Not because of hunger for the first time. His belly was filled with warm porridge, hot milk, and the gentle pat of the cook's hand on his head. Not because of cold. He was wrapped in a blanket softer than anything he'd ever touched in his life. Not because of fear. No one asked too many questions. No one forced him to tell his story. They only said, "When you're ready, you'll tell us. If not, just stay." But it was precisely because of all those kind things that Samuel couldn't sleep. He was used to wind blowing through holes in the roof, used to rats clinking cans in the night, used to being forgotten by the world. Here, it was too quiet. Too gentle. Like a fragile dream that might vanish the moment he stirred. He walked to the window and gently pulled back the curtain. The moon hung in the sky like a silver sliver. Samuel placed both hands over his heart and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "But even if this is just a short miracle, I accept it. I don't need to have everything. I just don't want to lose her." It wasn't a flowery prayer. It wasn't profound. But it was the most sincere vow a child the world never welcomed could make. And then, the heavens began preparing an answer. The next morning, while the whole shelter still slept, Samuel was awakened by a small sound like a faint sigh coming from the yard. He slipped on his sandals, draped the scarf from the other day over his shoulders, and tiptoed outside. Right at the gate, amidst the mist, stood a man. There was no mistaking it. The same man who had left the scarf for them under the bridge. He still wore the same old coat. But this time, in his hands wasn't a bag of blankets. It was a large cardboard box filled with fresh bread, some old toys, and children's clothes. When he saw Samuel, he smiled. Not dramatically, not urgently. Just the calm smile of someone who had remembered what truly matters in life. "Good morning, little one," he said, placing the box down. "I couldn't get you out of my mind. All night, we talked in spirit." Samuel ran to him, wide-eyed, and whispered, "Are you an angel?" The man chuckled, though his voice cracked with emotion. "No, I was once a hungry boy just like you. One day, someone gave me half an apple. And that half kept me alive to this very day." Samuel didn't say anything. But his hands gripped the man's coat tightly. And for the first time, he hugged someone. Not because he wanted something. Not because he needed to beg. But simply, because he had been seen with the heart. In that moment, something old and painful inside Samuel began to break apart. He was no longer a nameless wanderer. He was no longer the homeless kid. He was Samuel, the one who had begun to love. From the day the man now affectionately called Mr. Elias returned, Samuel felt a new warmth stirring in his once frozen heart. He was no longer the boy under the bridge with half a loaf of bread. He had begun to live. Mr. Elias didn't come to give charity. He brought no money, no grand words like some donors who passed through the shelter. He came simply to be present. Every afternoon, he'd bring a few loaves of freshly baked bread, a bag of fruit, or just an old book. He'd sit cross-legged on the ground, among the children playing, and tell stories. Stories about a man who once slept in an abandoned oven. Stories of small kindnesses from strangers that saved his life. Stories about nights when he begged for just one glance that didn't carry disgust. Each tale poured light into Samuel's soul. He listened wide-eyed, missing no detail. And slowly, he began to understand. He wasn't alone in his pain. Everyone had once been a Samuel. They just hid their dreams in different shapes. One evening, Mr. Elias called Samuel aside. "Do you know," he began, his voice like the hum of an old guitar, "your name? I chose it for a reason. In the Bible, Samuel was a child who heard the voice of God at a very young age. And I believe, you've heard something too from above, or from within." Samuel blushed. He couldn't believe a boy who once slept beside garbage could be compared to someone sacred. But Mr. Elias smiled, as if he had read his thoughts. "You gave your last piece of bread to a dog. Then shared the rest with a little girl. That's not what a homeless boy does. That's what someone with a great heart does." Samuel looked up. And for the first time in his life, he felt proud of himself. Soon after, Samuel began to change. He asked to help in the kitchen, washing dishes, wiping tables. Then he learned to cut vegetables, to clean, to scrub. Eventually he learned to bake bread. Under the guidance of the kind cook, Samuel learned how to knead dough, ferment yeast, and control heat. The first morning he successfully baked a soft round loaf. He didn't eat it. He placed it in the hands of the little girl, now nearly always at his side, and whispered, "Now, I can truly feed you." From that day on, Baking bread each morning became an unshakable ritual for Samuel. His small hands kneaded dough as fragrant steam rose like morning mist. The scent of bread filled the shelter, drawing smiles from hearts that had long gone numb. And every time Samuel handed someone a loaf, he always gave them a gentle hug. He once told Mr. Elias, "I think, without a hug, bread is just dough. It has no soul." One morning, the strict shelter manager unexpectedly called Samuel over after breakfast. She didn't say much, just gently stroked his hair and said, "You have a heart like a warm loaf of bread, Samuel. Soft in the center, crisp on the outside, and always ready to be shared." Samuel smiled shyly. But that night, he carefully wrote the sentence down in his very first notebook, the one he had been gifted. The heart of warm bread. When the other children were fast asleep, Samuel took out the old tripod, the cloth that once wrapped his hard piece of bread, and folded it carefully, placing it in a drawer like a treasure. To him, it wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was proof that God or heaven, or the Buddha, never abandons those who still believe. And then, on a bright sunny day, Mr. Elias arrived with a glow in his eyes. "Samuel," he said, "today I'm taking you somewhere special. Not far, but important." Samuel nodded, his hands still dusted with flour. He washed up quickly, dried off, and followed Elias down a red dirt road leading out of the city. They passed through old streets, markets, places where Samuel had once been chased away. But now, he looked at them differently. No anger. No bitterness. Just like someone who had risen above it all. When they reached the top of a low hill, Mr. Elias stopped. Before them lay an open field, wild grass, sparse trees, raw earth. But somehow, it felt peaceful. "This," he said, "is where I grew up. And now, it's yours." Samuel stood frozen. "Because you," Elias said slowly, "reminded me that family isn't blood. It's the place where a heart finds refuge." Samuel knelt down, his small hands grasping a clump of rough soil. "I'll take care of this place," he whispered. "I'll bring the kids here. I'll make it home like the one I once dreamed of under the bridge." Above them, the clouds parted. Light poured down. A new home was about to be born. Samuel sat silently for hours on that dry land, his hands tracing the earth as if trying to feel every inch that Elias had entrusted to him. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. Because it was the extension of a miracle that had once begun with a crust of stale bread and a tattered cloth. He looked up, tears in his eyes. "I don't know what I'll build here. But, if the heart is true, maybe that's enough." Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to build a mansion. Just plant seeds of love. The universe will handle the rest." And so they began. No budget. No blueprints. No noisy construction crews. Just one silver-haired man, a boy once called Garbage, a few volunteers from the old shelter, and a dream built with calloused hands. Samuel used his savings from baking to buy rough timber, old bricks, leftover paint. He collected discarded wood from workshops, asked electricians for spare wiring, and did everything he could to turn bricks into hope. The day they finished their first wall, Samuel shouted like he had found a treasure. "It's not a big house, but it's a place for those who've been left behind." People began calling it by a simple, heartfelt name, Samuel's home. But Samuel never claimed it. Instead, he hung a hand-carved wooden sign at the gate. "Here, we don't ask who you are. We only ask, are you hungry? Are you tired? Do you want a hug? The day the first child arrived no one ever forgot. A boy with tangled hair, eyes like burnt-out flames, holding an old cloth bag, stood silently at the gate. Samuel came to greet him. He didn't ask his name. He didn't ask where his parents were. He simply reached out his hand and said, "Would you like some bread? There's fresh baked loaves and a seat by the warm stove. Oh, and a broken umbrella, in case you're afraid of rain." The boy burst into tears. He hugged Samuel as if the whole world had just been returned to him. Then 2, 3, 5 more came. Some had just been abandoned. Some fled abusive hands. Some were simply lost in the crowd of invisibility. Samuel welcomed them all. With a non-judgmental smile. With buttery loaves baked over flame. And with hugs firm enough to feel like the roots of a mighty tree. The little girl from long ago. The one who once trembled beside a garbage pile. Now no longer feared the light. She painted murals on the walls, giggled with newly arrived siblings, and one day, wrote on a doorframe, "Samuel, the first person who called me by a human name." The small house slowly came to life. One corner held the simple bread oven, always glowing. Each morning, Samuel woke before sunrise to prepare each loaf like he was sending letters to heaven. He'd say, "Each loaf is a thank you to the one who never abandoned us." Another corner became a garden. The children planted spinach, tomatoes, water morning glory. No one taught them, yet they learned quickly. They knew when the plants needed water, and when they needed kind words. Samuel told them, "Plants are living souls. If you love them, they'll give you sweet fruit." But the place that touched people the most was the quiet room. There, no one spoke. No one asked questions. There were only soft cushions, a window facing the sky, and a wooden board that read, "If today you don't want to say anything, that's okay. We are still here. We are still with you." Every night, Samuel wrote in his journal. The same notebook labeled "The Heart of Warm Bread." Recording every small story, every smile, every tear from the children he now called family. One night, when everyone had gone to sleep, Samuel stood alone beneath a tree. Moonlight poured over the small house they had just finished building. He closed his eyes, clutching the old tripod now washed clean and embroidered with patterns. "There was a time I had so little. I thought I had nothing. But now I understand. A heart that refuses to stop loving is everything." And from the highest place in the night sky, a single shooting star quietly streaked by. No one saw it, except him. One spring morning, Samuel was busy placing steaming loaves of bread onto a long wooden table in the kitchen when the wooden gate outside creaked open. No loud noise, just a gentle click, but to Samuel, that sound always carried deep meaning. Because every time that gate opened, it meant a soul was finding its way back to the light. He quickly washed his hands, dried them on his flour-stained apron, and ran outside. A little boy, about 6 years old, stood there drenched, hair tangled, wide eyes staring at the house as if he were seeing something too beautiful to be real. In his hand was a torn plastic bag holding nothing but a mismatched pair of slippers and an empty water bottle. Samuel knelt down, resting both hands on his knees. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The boy shook his head. Samuel didn't press further. He simply smiled and said softly, "Then today, I'll give you one. How about Esperanza? It means hope." The boy hesitated, then nodded his first nod, like a sign that he was ready to enter this world. A world with no belts, no slaps for crying too loud, and no punishment for simply existing. Samuel led Esperanza into the kitchen, dried his hair with a soft towel, and carefully tore a warm loaf of bread in half. "This part's for you. The other half you can share, if you want. Here, everything can multiply, when it starts with love." Esperanza clutched the bread with both hands like a treasure. He didn't eat right away. He just sat there, staring at Samuel for a long while and then suddenly hugged him tight. No words. No tears. But the hug made Samuel choke up. Not from pain, but because the old cracks in his heart were quietly healing. That night, after the other children had fallen asleep, Samuel quietly placed the old tripod into a glass frame hanging in the center of the dining room. Underneath it, he wrote by hand. This is where a miracle began with just half a loaf of bread. The next morning, a group of university students came to visit. They had read about the House of Warm Bread in a local newspaper. At first, they only planned to film and take photos for a media project. But after seeing the children kneading dough, watering plants, and sweeping floors, they were overwhelmed. One of them, a girl named Maria, burst into tears when she saw Esperanza hugging a tattered stuffed bear and whispering, "Now I have a friend." When the students left, they didn't just leave behind cameras. They left behind their hearts. They created a social media page called From a Crust of Bread and began a fundraiser to help Samuel expand the home. Then, something no one expected happened. Within a week, hundreds of people from across the country sent letters, donations, bread, books, and blessings for Samuel. Some had once been orphans. Some had once wanted to end their lives because they felt no one needed them. But they all said the same thing. Samuel's story gave them a reason to believe in people again. Samuel read every letter. He didn't rewrite them. He didn't print them. But he stored them in his heart, like seeds. He knew, someday, he would plant those seeds somewhere farther. Mr. Elias, now older, frielier, his hair more silver than ever, came to visit on a bright afternoon. He stood before the glass frame containing the tripod, his eyes moist. "You've gone far beyond anything I ever imagined, Samuel," he said. Samuel didn't respond right away. He looked at the children playing tag outside, then whispered, "I didn't do anything great. I just kept living the dream I once had. That a loaf of bread could save a life. And a hug could save a soul." Mr. Elias gently squeezed his shoulder, then pulled something from his pocket. A small hand-carved wooden pin in the shape of a loaf of bread, with the words below, "Faith doesn't need eyes to see, only a heart to feel. Wear this," he said, "for when you're tired so you remember why you began." Samuel held it with trembling hands. That day, for the first time, Samuel didn't bake. He spent the whole afternoon in the yard with the kids, laughing out loud, rolling in the grass, eyes closed beneath the sun. Because he understood. Sometimes, the only way to keep light alive, is to let it spread. One October morning, before the sun had even lifted the curtain of mist over the fields, Samuel stood before the now faded wooden gate. In his arms was a basket of warm bread, its scent butter and yeast wafting like sacred incense. He placed each loaf carefully into small paper bundles, wrapped in old newspaper folded neatly like precious gifts. Today was different. Today, for the first time, a group of children from Samuel's home would go out not to find a new place, but to carry bread and hugs to others. To plant the light they had once received. Samuel called them the flame bearers. "You don't need to say anything," he instructed. Just give bread to someone in need, and hug them if they let you. And if they don't, that's okay. Fire doesn't force warmth. It just waits. The children nodded. Each one had a small bag of bread over their shoulder, carrying the warmth of the home that had saved their souls. In a neighboring city, a man named Gaspar lived under the eaves of a market. He once had a family, a small shop. But one night, gambling took everything. Now, he survived on soda cans and sometimes picked vegetables from behind the supermarket dumpsters. That morning, he sat sorting damp cardboard scraps, when he sensed a shadow fall over him. He looked up. A boy about 10 years old, hair messy, clothes stitched with patches, was standing before him, holding out a warm loaf of bread. "It's fresh. Please eat," the boy said, voice soft as breath. Gaspar almost refused. But when he looked closely at the loaf, he suddenly remembered a familiar smell. From the day he married his wife, her mother had baked that same scent. "Why are you giving this to me? You don't even know who I am," he snapped, his tone sharp to mask the shame. The boy didn't reply. He simply placed the bread down, and stepped forward, and hugged him tightly, just for 2 seconds. But in that moment, Gaspar's heart shook, like someone had knocked on a long locked door inside him. On the wrapping paper, written in neat handwriting, "Samuel taught me that bread without a hug is just dough." Gaspar covered his face and cried. Not from hunger, but because someone had touched the human part of him that he had buried long ago. At the house on the hill, Samuel began receiving dozens of handwritten letters, a few photos taken with old cameras, and embroidered handkerchiefs stitched with colorful thread. The people receiving bread were not strangers. There was the elderly woman who lived alone with her cats, the bus driver who had just lost his son, the 12-year-old child carrying the burden of a father's addiction. And all of them wrote the same thing. "Thank you for not asking my name. Only for asking, are you hungry?" Samuel pinned each letter on the wall of a small room behind the kitchen, and gave the place a name. The corner where miracles are remembered. Whenever someone in the house felt weary, he would say, "Go there. Read a letter. Not to remember what you've done, but to remember who you once were." And then, one day completely unexpected, the woman who once drove Samuel away from the market walked through the gate of the House of Hope. Her hair had turned white. Her steps were slow. In her hands, a basket of fruit and a letter. The little girl from long ago, now a young woman, in charge of the home's accounting, came to greet her. When the woman saw her face, she trembled. "I once called you a curse," she said, her voice cracking. The young woman didn't speak. She simply opened the gate. The old woman was led into the large common room, where Samuel was sweeping the floor with a worn-out bamboo broom. They looked at each other. The silence stretched, so still the wind outside hesitated. Samuel stepped forward, gently the way he once stepped into the world with bleeding feet. "I don't blame you," he said. "Because if you hadn't sent me away that day, I might never have found that one destined loaf of bread." The woman collapsed to the floor. She wept like a child. Samuel bent down and embraced her, wordless. In his heart echoed a phrase, old but never faded. Forgiveness doesn't erase the wrong. It eases the soul. Outside, the children were playing with homemade soap bubbles. One shimmering bubble floated through the window, then popped in the sun. but its light never really disappeared. That morning, Samuel didn't bake like he usually did. Instead, he sat on the bench under the porch, facing the small yard bathed in sunlight. In his hands, a rough wooden frame, holding a faded photo of a skinny boy hugging an even skinnier dog, in a sandy lot strewn with trash. "That was me," Samuel said to a boy sitting beside him, "before I knew I had a name." The boy, about 10, was named Timo, one of the newest children welcomed from the West bus station, where he had been sleeping between shuttered ticket counters. "You didn't have a name when you were little?" Timo asked. Samuel gently shook his head and smiled. "No. People called me all kinds of things. The stinky one, the beggar, the one who dirties store doors. But no one ever gave me a name. Until a shelter manager looked me in the eyes and said, 'From now on, your name is Samuel.'" Timo looked at the picture, then back at Samuel. "I have a name now too, right?" "Yes," Samuel nodded, eyes misty. "And from now on, you're a part of something far bigger than any name." That story didn't end on the porch. That same day, Samuel held a naming ceremony for all the children who had never been called by their real names. It wasn't fancy. No cake, no flowers. Just a small wooden board with hand-painted words. "Today, you'll be called by the name that love chose for you." Each child was called up, one by one. Samuel and the young woman, once the trembling girl by the trash heap, whispered fitting names to each. Some children cried. Some laughed. Some simply nodded. One girl named Nia, meaning faith that doesn't require proof, had been left at a gas station with a note. "Someone please take care of her. I cannot." Nia stood before the name board, her tiny fists clenched. "Can I keep this name forever?" she asked, eyes lifted. Samuel nodded. "No one can take away a name given by love. Not time, not poverty, not even forgetting." That evening, Samuel opened a special notebook. Its cover was made from scrap wood, and its pages were assembled from paper salvaged from the trash. Not fancy paper, but pages once discarded. He called it the Sutra of the Forgotten. He wrote down every story, not for the world to read, but to preserve the light. Today, 6 children received names. One was abandoned in a cardboard box in the rain. One used to sleep beneath a bus. But today, all of them know they exist. Not as shadows, but as real human beings. Then Samuel closed the book and looked out the window. Outside, the newly named children lay side by side in the shared bedroom, where walls were painted with lotuses, skies, and open hands. Some still curled up tight, unused to comfort. But their eyes had changed. No longer guarded. Now waiting for a light, a hug, a morning greeting with their name. In the days that followed, Samuel began receiving invitations from faraway places. People wanted him to tell his story, to make videos, to turn the House of Warm Bread into a model program. But Samuel hesitated. Not because he feared fame, but because he knew miracles don't live in videos or applause. They live in daily acts done in silence. Sweeping floors, wrapping bread, placing a hand on the shoulder of a child who forgot how to smile. He shared his doubts with Elias, now frail, but still visiting every week. "I don't know if I should grow, or stay the same." Elias looked up at the sky and smiled. "You don't need to decide something big. Just ask. Today, who needs to be seen? And go find them." the rest. Leave to heaven. Samuel bowed his head. Hands clasped like a silent prayer. That evening, as a gentle breeze drifted through the doors, he joined the children playing a game of name-guessing in the yard. A little girl climbed into his lap and asked, "Uncle Samuka, if I leave tomorrow, will you still remember me?" He pulled her close, resting his chin on her hair, sun-scented. "Not just remember. I'll say your name every morning. Even if you're not here." She giggled, snuggling in. Somewhere in the dark, a single star dropped from the sky, as if someone had just lit a small lantern in their heart. A week after the naming ceremony, Samuel received a handwritten letter from a charity organization in a distant province. The writer was a teacher named Lucia, who was running a free classroom in the mountains, a place where children had never seen toasted bread, nor ever been called by their real names. "We heard about Samuel," she wrote, "from a child who once lived at your shelter. He said that every morning you baked bread, and every evening you hugged a soul. He said you didn't teach him how to live, you taught him that he deserved to." Samuel read the letter in silence, as if reciting a sacred verse. At the bottom, Lucia added, "If you can, please help us light the same flame you once lit in him." Without a moment of hesitation, Samuel folded the letter, stepped into the yard, and called out to the children studying beneath the porch. "We're about to begin a new journey," he said. 2 days later, a small truck driven by one of Mr. Elias's old friends pulled up to the gate of the House of Hope. Samuel and 5 children, the flame bearers of the home, brought along flour, yeast, clean trepo, and a few folded old umbrellas. Their destination, a remote village nestled in the mountains, where children walked 3 kilometers to attend class, and meals were often nothing but rice porridge diluted with stream water. No paved roads. No Wi-Fi. But plenty of eyes that had never been looked into with love. As the truck came to a stop, the village children ran out, curious about the newcomers. A boy of about 9 cautiously approached Samuel, his gaze a mixture of fear and wonder. Samuel knelt and reached out his hand. "I'm Samuel. What's your name?" The boy lowered his head and whispered, "They call me useless." Samuel froze. A chill ran down his spine. Then he smiled gently. "Then from today on, your name is Tamdung, courage of the heart. Because you were brave enough to walk up to a stranger. And that, my dear, is something many grown ups can't do." The boy's eyes widened. For the first time, someone had called him not by what was wrong, but by what he had done right. For a whole week in the village, Samuel and the kids organized baking sessions right in the schoolyard, wood fires, clay ovens, the smell of butter mixing with laughter. The first loaves came out a little burnt around the edges. But every single one was shared with 2 hands and a hug. Each child from Samuel's team had a role. One taught how to wash hands before kneading dough. One showed how to wrap the bread in paper. One told the story of how Uncle Sam once slept under a bridge, and now, look at him. And one had a single job: to hug. Just that. They stood at the end of the line, hugging each child one by one. Lucia stood at a distance, quietly watching it all. She cried more times than she could count, watching those once dimmed eyes light up again. Because of a cracked loaf of bread, a hug, and a brand new name. "You know," she said to Samuel, "people here used to say children are like wild weeds. But you watered each sprout." Samuel didn't reply. He simply bowed his head. On the final night in the village, the entire community gathered around a bonfire. Children sat between adults, holding bread in their hands, eyes glowing as they listened to fairy tales. Told not by grown ups, but by other children. Samuel stood with an old tripod in hand, embroidered with the words, "From a single crust of bread, we can build a whole world." He held the cloth high, then handed it to Lucia. "This is your flag now. When the children here know how to share bread, call each other by kind names, and hug like it's the most natural thing, then this place will be a home." Lucia took it, her hands trembling, as if she were holding a torch lit by someone else's heart. On the way back, Samuel sat in the back of the truck, eyes half closed, notebook in hand. This week, 46 children were given new names. Some chose flower colors. Some chose the first sound they heard from a friend. One chose the name warmth. "Because," he said, "that's the one thing I want to keep forever. There's no miracle too far. Only the question of whether we're willing to share the bread we already have." Samuel looked up. In the distance, the lights of the shelter reappeared, flickering like a small star on the hill. He pressed his hands together and whispered into the wind, "Thank you, life, for not letting me become a stray wind, but a breath of warmth for someone lost." That night, when Samuel returned to the house on the hill after the long trip, everything was as still as before. The wind rustled through the red-tiled roof. Moonlight tilted through the wooden window, and the wind chime at the entrance whispered a quiet greeting from the earth. But in Samuel's heart, something had changed. He sat by the window, his Sutra of the Forgotten notebook resting on his lap, a worn fountain pen gripped in hand. Yet the blank page remained untouched. Not because he had nothing to write, but because he needed a moment of silence, to listen to the invisible things moving inside his chest. From afar, he heard the laughter of children. They were playing the game of name swap, each child calling themselves what they felt best described them that day. One was Sky. One chose Gentle Sunday. And one stubbornly said, "I'm tomorrow because today I'm still not happy enough." Samuel chuckled. A tired laugh, but deeply fulfilled. He turned the page and began writing. When you give someone a name through love, you're not just calling them, you're waking them up. A child can be called trouble all their life, until one day, someone walks up and says, "No, you are a journey. And every journey deserves to be seen through to the end." The next day, Samuel received a small package. The sender didn't include a name, only a note. For the place where miracles are made by hand and heart. Inside was a hand-painted picture frame. A loaf of bread, cracked down the center. Light shining from above. And a handwritten line in brush script. "Fu poco, pero fu con fe." It was little, but it was with faith. And that changed everything. Samuel placed the picture on the shelter's communal dining table. Everyone who passed by bowed their heads. No explanation needed. Because each of them had once experienced that moment, when all they had was half a loaf of bread and an unnamed faith. That afternoon, the girl who had once been found trembling near the trash, now Samuel's right hand in running the shelter, walked into his room. "Brother Sam, I've been meaning to ask you something." "Yes." Samuel looked up. "If one day, you're no longer here, do we still have the right to call this place the House of Hope?" Samuel stared at her, for a long time. Then he stood, walked to an old wooden cabinet, and retrieved a box. Inside, the original tripod now washed, patched with blue floral fabric. Its edges hand-stitched in red thread. He handed it to her. I used to think miracles only happen once. But I've learned. Every time someone shares a crust of bread. Every time someone gives a new name to a soul. Every time a hug is given for no reason. That miracle is reborn. The house of hope isn't in the roof tiles. It lives in every small act of kindness that keeps a child's heart warm. The girl wept, holding the tripod like an unwritten will, passed down from one soul to another. That night, Samuel didn't sleep. He walked quietly through every room, gently pulling blankets over sleeping children, their lips still softly mouthing their new names. Some smiled in their dreams. Others clutched a small loaf of bread like a treasure. He whispered, "Thank you, for letting me be a small part of your life." Then he sat at the familiar window bench, placed his hand over his chest, and closed his eyes. No prayer. No dreams. Just listening. Listening to his own heart. Every beat still echoing a promise he once made. If I survive, I will become the brother I never had. And he had kept that promise. The next morning, the young woman came into Samuel's room as usual to invite him to breakfast. He was still there. But his eyes were closed. And a gentle smile rested on his lips. In his hands was the Sutra of the Forgotten, opened to the final page. And written in a single line. If I am not here tomorrow, let the bread speak for me. I once loved with all I had. Samuel's funeral was as simple as he had wished. No expensive flowers. Just a warm loaf of bread placed beside his old tripod. And hundreds of children from every corner returned to the home. Each carried a new name, and a memory of the first hug that made them believe they were never abandoned. The girl, now the keeper of the flame, stood before everyone, her voice trembling. Samuel didn't die. He was planted. And now he lives on in each of us. Outside, a soft rain fell, like a blessing from the sky. And in the wind, someone called. Samuel. That name had now become a verb. A way of living. A presence that needed no body. After Samuel's passing, the atmosphere at the House of Hope changed. But not in the way one expects after losing a beloved soul. No one collapsed in sorrow. No one drowned in grief. Instead, every action, every smile, every shared loaf became quieter, but more resolute than ever. Because everyone knew. Samuel wasn't just a person. He was a way of living. And that had to be continued. Not through tears, but through action. In the first week after the farewell, there was no grand memorial service. But something quietly changed. In the center of the kitchen where Samuel once stood every morning kneading dough, a small table was placed. On it, a warm loaf of bread and a hand-carved wooden frame. The inscription read, "Each day, place one loaf and one prayer here. Not for the departed, but to remind the living. Love never cools." And so it became tradition. Each morning, a child was chosen to bake Samuel's bread for today. And every child poured their full sincerity into it. Kneading the dough like they were touching a memory. Baking it like they were keeping the fire alive for a soul that never left. One said, "I don't know if he likes sweet or savory, so I made both today." Another whispered, "I was sad, so the bread's a little burnt, but I think Sam will understand." And he would. He absolutely would. Not long after, the Samuel House of Hope became a phrase spreading across the region. Not because of a media campaign, Not due to a flashy fundraiser, but because of small things. A girl once raised in the home opened a free school in a nearby rural village. She hung a modest sign at the door. Here, we don't ask if you're smart or slow. We only ask, has anyone ever believed in you? A boy once abused now a baker in a small city shop. Gave one free loaf each day to a homeless person in the park. When asked why, he replied, because once, someone gave me half a loaf. And I'm alive today, because of that half. And more shelters began to appear, not perfect copies, but true echoes. Each one carried a breath of Samuel's soul. Different names. Different colors. But always the same principles. A long bench near the gate, so anyone tired can sit before deciding to come in. A loaf of bread kept warm each morning, for the first to arrive. And a handwritten sign near the kitchen. We begin with the least, and give it with the most. One spring day, the girl, once the trembling child beneath the garbage pile, now the director of the entire Hope Homes network, received a letter from a remote village near the border. It was written by a 12-year-old boy named Leo, who lived alone with his grandmother. He wrote, I don't have parents. I don't have siblings. But one day, a stranger gave me bread. On the wrapping it said, Samuel believes you deserve a name spoken with love. I kept reading it again and again. And I decided, from now on, my name is Leo. Because that's the name of someone brave. The woman folded the letter, eyes stinging. She walked to the back of the house, where the first wooden sign Samuel ever carved still hung. No one is invisible if seen through the heart. She placed her hand on it. Softly. As if touching a promise. That night, in the deep sleep of the children and their guardian, someone dreamed of a mud brick house, where a boy held a cracked loaf of bread, and smiled beneath the moon. He turned back. Said nothing. Just raised his hand. Then vanished into a soft light. The next morning, little Nia, now the head assistant baker, whispered as she opened the oven. Last night, I saw brother Sam in my dream. Today's loaf is for him. And I think, he'll like it? Even if it's a little cracked. No one replied. Only the wind chime on the porch gently rang. That July, early rains came unexpectedly, soaking the dark red roof tiles of the House of Hope. But inside the hearts of the children, no one felt damp. Because at the center of the kitchen, where Samuel once stood, the fire still burned. Not from wood, but from memory. One rainy morning, the girl, now officially titled Executive Director of the Hope Homes Network, stood before a whiteboard in the community room. Children, she said softly. Today, we'll choose 3 new provinces to open more homes. The kids erupted in joy. Each one raised their hand, each hand holding a reason. Over there, I know a neighborhood where kids dig through trash. I met one who doesn't have shoes. Back where I used to live, my friends only ate rice with salt. In my grandma's village, people don't hug. They just shout at each other. The director stood speechless. Every word bloomed like lotus flowers rising from the mud. Simple, honest, and heartbreakingly beautiful. She pulled out a large map and began to mark it. Each red dot was a quiet vow. We will bring light to this place. Not through electricity, but through bread. Through hugs. Through names. In a southern coastal city, a new shelter quietly opened. No grand sign, just a wooden board with handwritten words. We don't raise children, we nurture trust. There, a boy named Min, once a wanderer near the fishing port, once a thief of bread in hunger, was now the one teaching younger kids how to knead dough. Each time I knead, he often said, his rough, darkened hands radiating warmth, is one more time I forgive the past. Min hung a charcoal drawing on the kitchen wall. A portrait of a middle-aged man sitting by a clay oven. And behind him, the silhouette of a child offering a loaf of bread. No name was written. Only one short sentence. He's the reason I know how to warm others today. In the northern mountains, a small school stood beside a modest shelter. Children of minority ethnic groups, once unable to read, once unsure how to introduce themselves, were now learning how to call each other by names of kindness. The sole teacher there had once been a boy embraced by Samuel on a freezing night at the original House of Hope. Now, every morning, he began class with one question. Today, who needs to be seen in a different way? One child raised their hand. Today, I'm the sun because I want to be warm. Another whispered, I'm the wind because I got hit yesterday, and I want to fly away from sadness. The teacher didn't correct. Didn't laugh. He just nodded and wrote every name on the board. Because, as Samuel once said, a name chosen by the child is the first garment their soul ever wears. While new homes continued to rise, the original house on the hill remained like an old tree. Still, quiet, and deeply rooted. Bread still came out of the oven every morning. Children were still given names the moment they stepped through the gate. But now, in the corner by the oven, a small object had appeared. Samuel's old tripod bag, now discolored, was encased in a glass frame. Below it, a brass plaque engraved by hand with Samuel's final words. If I am not here tomorrow, let the bread love in my place. The adults read it and cried. The children read it and held hands a little tighter. One day, a journalist from the national television channel visited. He was astonished by what he saw. The peace, the dignity, the flower-covered hands. The eyes that once carried pain now lit with joy. He asked the woman in charge, if Samuel were alive, what do you think he would want now? She thought for a moment, then replied, he wouldn't want anything more. Because what he wished for, is blooming everywhere. And you? What will you do next? She looked toward the glass frame holding the old tripod and answered with quiet certainty. I will live as if he's still watching my every action. Because the presence of someone who loves you doesn't rely on their body. It relies on whether your heart still carries what they gave you. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, the woman went into the kitchen alone. She opened the oven and pulled out a honey-scented loaf. Taking a small bite, she picked up the logbook beside the oven and wrote, Today, a child called herself Little Hope. She said, if no one lights a candle, then I will be the first spark. Sam, do you know? That child, she is you. From another life. And today, you are still lighting your own flame. Outside, the wind chime rang in a windless night. And somewhere in the distant sky, a star quietly shifted. Like the gaze of someone smiling. That morning, the hilltop where the House of Hope stood welcomed the sunrise in an unusual way. Not blazing, not radiant. But soft and calm like a hand resting gently on the forehead of someone weary. The wind didn't rush. It merely stirred the paper flowers growing around the fence. No one spoke. No one needed to. Today was Samuel's first death anniversary. The children wore their finest clothes. Not to perform, but to remember. Each brought something small that symbolized their memory of Samuel. One child clutched an old torn umbrella. Another held a tiny loaf of bread they had baked themselves. One carried only a name tag. I am the one who was called by love. The young woman, now the spiritual mother of hundreds of children, stood in the courtyard, gazing at the stone benches arranged beneath the tree where Samuel once sat and wrote in his journal. In her hands was a piece of paper. But just as she was about to read, she paused. She folded it gently and looked up at the sky. "You don't need me to read anything, do you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You need me to live. And to live kindly." Then she turned to the children and clapped her hands. "Today, no one cries. Today, we tell funny stories about Sam." The children cheered. A shy little girl stepped forward. "One time, Brother Sam gave me a burnt loaf. It was all black. I cried. He said, 'Well then, today you eat the dark side of the bread. Tomorrow, you get the bright side.'" The courtyard erupted in laughter. Another boy shared. "Brother Sam taught me to bake, and I mixed up the salt and sugar." Everyone ate in silence. Then he said, "When we first learn to love, we always mess up the flavor." Laughter burst like a spring stream, washing away the last tears clinging to the corners of their eyes. One by one, the children came forward, each sharing a story. No microphone. No stage. Just a warm circle among the living, and one who had lived fully. At the end of the ceremony, the youngest child in the home, 5-year-old Emilio, unexpectedly stepped into the center of the circle, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He couldn't read. But he opened it anyway, looked up at the woman in charge, and said, "Ma'am, I dreamed of Brother Sam last night. He told me to write something." The woman knelt beside him, softly. "Then go ahead and read it. I don't know the words, but I remember them in my head." He took a deep breath, then said slowly, "When I hug someone, I am Samuel." The entire home fell silent. No birds. No wind. Only that truth, simple, raw, and immense. Because Emilio didn't memorize that line. He had become it. That afternoon, a group of strangers came to visit the shelter. They didn't film. Didn't ask for interviews. They simply walked in quietly and sat by the porch. One was a doctor. One a recovering addict. One had just lost a loved one. They listened to the children's stories, received a shared loaf of bread, and were hugged by a small child with no explanation. As they prepared to leave, an elderly woman, her eyesight faded, turned and asked, "If I have no one left to hug, can I still be Samuel?" A child replied, "If you remember what it feels like to be hungry, then yes, you are still Samuel." The answer dropped into their hearts like water. No need to analyze. Just let it soak in. That night, the woman opened Samuel's journal, now a sacred heirloom, and wrote the first new entry in a year since his passing. Today, Samuel returned. In Emilio's hands. In Nia's laughter. In the salty loaf men baked wrong. In the hug from a child who didn't know your name. In the eyes of a woman who lost everything. And in my heart. The one who once feared the dark. She looked up. Moonlight bathed the window frame. "I'm not afraid anymore, Sam. Because I've learned how to become the light." Outside, beneath the tree, the old wind chime rang softly. A familiar melody, like a message. "I heard you." Years passed since Samuel left the world. But his name never disappeared. There were no statues, no national holidays, no street named after him. Yet in the smallest corners of life, he was still there. At a late-night bus stop, a teenage boy offered bread to a man slumped in hunger. When asked his name, he simply said, "Call me Sam." I learned from someone that every loaf is a prayer for someone still unseen. In a remote mountain classroom, a teacher wrote on the blackboard, "Who are you?" The room filled with answers. But one small boy stood and declared, "I'm the first in my family to ever be called by my real name." At a train station in Europe, a young Vietnamese volunteer handed out bread to refugees. When asked why, he held up a worn handkerchief embroidered with the words, "Few poco, pero few con fe." It was little, but it was with faith. And that changed everything. And then, one breezy night, on the very hill where the first House of Hope once stood, now a center for compassionate action training people to open homes worldwide, a newly arrived girl sat curled up by the stove. She didn't know anyone. She hadn't said a word. Samuel was no longer there to hug her. But a young boy sat down beside her, offering a loaf of bread. "Eat with me." Here, everyone was scared once. But it gets easier if you eat with someone. The girl hesitantly took a bite. An older woman approached and gently asked, "What name would you like?" The girl stayed quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "I want to be called Light." The woman smiled. "Why, dear?" The girl looked toward the window, where the moonlight spilled across the tile. "Because I don't want to be the child in the dark anymore. I want someone to see me. Even just once." Outside, the wind chime sang again. The wind had never stopped. And the light had never gone out. Because when we live with faith and compassion, we never truly die. We are simply multiplied in the lives of those who never knew who they were, until someone called them by a name free of judgment. The story is still being written. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? How might it shape the way you live or forgive? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us create more stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you in the next video.